to nobody's surprise, the Bernie bro myth has returned. And since it's no longer applicable to Bernie Sanders himself, since statistically it's not applicable, since Bernie Sanders is not just popular among straight white males, he's popular among women, among people of color. Well, now this same tired Bernie bro myth argument is being applied to individuals like Cynthia Nixon. So this is what CNN's Harry Anten argues when talking about polling results between Andrew Cuomo and Cynthia Nixon. Cuomo is leading across pretty much all demographic groups, but he's particularly strong among African Americans. Although no crosstab of black voters was available in the Quinnipiac poll, an earlier Siena College poll put Cuomo's margin over Nixon among black voters at 74 to 17%. His advantage among black voters is no fluke. When Ocasio-Cortez was cruising district-wide, she was weak in black neighborhoods. She was able to win in large part because of her strength in areas with larger white populations. Progressive Daniel Biss lost the Illinois gubernatorial primary earlier this year, at least partially because he ran weak in the black neighborhoods of Chicago. In 2016, Senator Bernie Sanders, a Vermont independent who caucuses with Democrats, could never quite overcome Hillary Clinton's connection with black voters. She won them in New York by 50 points, for example. Even for Cuomo, a black base is nothing new. When he beat Teachout 4 years ago, he did best in areas that were predominantly black. Why are progressive insurgents struggling with black voters? Black Democrats are more likely to consider themselves moderate or conservative than other Democrats. They also are more likely to identify as Democrats instead of independents who lean Democratic. That is, they are far more comfortable with more moderate Democrats in the establishment than other Democrats are, especially whites. Now, obviously, it's possible for progressive challengers to win a primary even with this difficulty, see Ocasio-Cortez, but until candidates like Nixon and Sanders solve their black voter problem, they're going to be limited in their electoral victories. Now, the underlying implication of this article isn't subtle at all. What he's saying here is that, if black voters self-identify as more moderate or conservative, and progressives clearly aren't able to reach black voters in a way that progressives would make themselves more electable is if they become more moderate. So if they stop being progressive, that'll make progressivism in general more marketable to black voters. But if you take progressivism away from the progressive candidates, then you have nothing left. But this assumption here, it's incredibly misleading for a number of reasons. Now, I will say that he is correct in that progressives statistically do have a more difficult time reaching black voters, but he's overstating the finding of this specific survey that he cites here because, for starters, the sample size of this survey is relatively small. So with a sample size of 745 respondents, black voters only account for 9% of this study, meaning he's basing the entire premise of this argument off of 67 black voters, which just isn't a large enough sample to draw such a big conclusion from. Now, additionally, there are other issues that I have with the methodology of this particular survey that he cites. Wealthier people with an income of $100,000 or more per year are overrepresented in this sample. So they account for 39%, or about 290 people. Now, why is that a problem? Well, the goal for these polls is to reproduce a sample that largely mirrors the voting population who they're trying to poll. Generally speaking, most American households can't afford a $500 emergency expense. And even though the median income in New York is higher than the national average, it's no surprise that mostly wealthy people would opt for the more moderate candidate. I mean, if you stack this survey with a bunch of wealthy people, 39% wealthy people, then obviously, if you give them the choice between a progressive and a moderate candidate, they're going to opt for the moderate. So the results are skewed in favor of the moderate to begin with because of how many wealthy people you have in this particular survey. So that's another issue that I had with the methodology of this survey and in general with the argument itself. Now, I don't know the breakdown of wealthy black voters, but it's problematic. The methodology is questionable, to say the least. Now, the second problem that I have with Harry's argument is that he is implying that the only way to appeal to black voters who self-identify as moderate is to become more moderate. However, what he's not telling you is that most voters identify as conservative or moderate. In 2016, Gallup found that only 25% of the country self-identifies as liberal, whereas 36% identify as conservative. Now, that would be a compelling argument if you just stop there and you take voters at their word that if they say they're conservative or moderate, that they really are conservative or moderate. The problem is that when you disaggregate the policies from political identities, you'll see that how somebody self-identifies isn't the best gauge of how liberal, conservative, or moderate they really are. Because when you go issue by issue, most Americans are overwhelmingly progressive. When you look at Medicare for all, free college, a jobs guarantee, marijuana legalization, abortion, marriage equality, voters all support these issues overwhelmingly in spite of the fact that most people identify as either conservative or moderate. So to simply say, well, these black voters, they say they're more moderate or conservative, so you need to be more politically moderate or conservative, well, that's misleading because that might not mean that they'd support traditionally conservative or moderate policies because, like all voters, they might just think that they're moderate, but if you ask them how they feel about progressive policy issues, they might surprise you and they might actually support it. In fact, I'd argue that they're more likely to support those issues given the fact that these issues are overwhelmingly popular. Now, finally, the last problem that I had with this article is that even if Bernie Sanders did struggle to reach black voters in 2016, which he did, Harry is making this argument while simultaneously disregarding a Harvard-Harris survey from 2017, which actually found that Bernie Sanders' approval rating was the highest among black voters at 73%. That's a 21-point difference compared to whites. Now, in January of 2018, a Quinnipiac poll found that the difference between white and black voters when it came to Bernie's favorability was even higher. In this poll, 70% of black voters had a favorable view of Bernie Sanders, which is 27 points higher than it is among whites. Now, why is that the case? Well, all that we can do is speculate, but it seems as though even if Bernie Sanders could have improved his outreach to black voters, well, part of the problem was that maybe they just didn't know who he was. Back in 2016, he didn't have the name recognition that Hillary Clinton had. So of course that's going to give him a disadvantage, but now that everyone knows who he is, and he's the most popular politician in the country, he has the highest approval rating among black voters. So if you're basing this argument on polling, why would CNN use this one poll with a questionable methodology and use that to extrapolate and extend this now debunked Bernie bro myth to progressive women like Cynthia Nixon and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez? Well, to me, I think it's because this is a strategy for them. Back in 2016, then Labor Secretary and now DNC Chairman Tom Perez told Hillary Clinton's team that a way to counter the inconvenient fact that Bernie Sanders was just more popular among millennials was to turn him off to minorities by painting him as the candidate that only appeals to whites, to white millennials specifically. And even though progressive policies resonate with all demographics, this Bernie bro myth was an effective way to smear Bernie Sanders, and it's still being used because it is, in fact, an effective strategy that turns people off to progressives. But look, maybe it's the case that this journalist wasn't applying this Bernie bro myth to Cynthia Nixon specifically to smear her, even if this is a tactic used by the Democratic Party establishment and was a strategy cooked up by Tom Perez in order to smear progressives. Maybe it's the case that he just unwittingly did the establishment's bidding by using a tactic that they use to smear progressives. All I can do really is speculate about his motives, but it is a bit curious that in an article that talks about aggregate polling between Andrew Cuomo and Cynthia Nixon, the title of this article centers around one poll that shows Cynthia Nixon performing poorly among black Democrats. It's a bit curious. So, if I had to speculate against his motives here, it seems as though he's trying to smear her, and he's not being an honest actor here. But look, we all know that the Bernie bro myth is something that really resonates with more centrist, neoliberal-minded Democratic Party voters. So it's why they continue to use it, even if now, when you look at polling data, those guys don't have a leg to stand on. They don't have an argument anymore. Now, generally speaking, yes, it's still the case that progressive up-and-comers like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Cynthia Nixon are struggling among blacks based on what limited polls we've seen and exit polls from the race on June 26th in New York 14. But if Bernie was struggling to reach black voters because of his lack of name recognition, maybe it's the case that Alexandria and Cynthia are also struggling because of their lack of name recognition. Even if she is an actress, that doesn't necessarily mean that voters will know her political leanings. They might not necessarily know that she's progressive, because when I first heard of Cynthia Nixon, I didn't know if she was just another elitist Hollywood actress who was getting into politics for self-serving reasons. But now we all know that she's the real deal. So maybe it's the case that they had the same assumption that I had about Cynthia Nixon. The problem is that you can't just generalize and say that progressive policies only apply to white males, because that's just not true. We know with the popularity of Bernie Sanders that these policies are extremely popular among people of color. So to continue to parrot this false narrative from the establishment, it's really harmful. It's propaganda.
Support this podcast by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Humanist Report.